welcome back. And you may notice that I'm a little smaller. Definitely, definitely could use with a little less me on the screen. This is lesson 2. What is liberalism? So after today's lesson, you should be able to define liberalism. You should be able to understand how, as an ideology, liberalism was born and how it has evolved, and identify some key characteristics that describe liberalism. Now, this lesson will not be 41 minutes long like the last one, but there's some excellent information here. So the beginning of this document has some notes for you. So it's what I would give to you if we were in class as a handout, but as we're not in class, I'm not photocopying things for you. We're saving some trees here. Not something I've ever been accused of before. So this would be some notes that help describe liberalism for you. So definitely read through it in its entirety. We'll look at some key aspects together here. But your assignment at the end of this video will be to go back, reread the notes, and see if it makes some sense to you. So, give me liberty, or give me death. Definitely a bold statement. Made in 1775 by Patrick Henry in Virginia. And you can see that in this statement, in his rally in support of the American Revolution, there's a tremendous value in that statement. Give me liberty or give me death. There's a tremendous value on liberty. If I can't have it, I'd rather die. So liberty in this sense is being used to describe the idea of freedom. And this was not new in 1775. People had been valuing freedom, liberty for various forms of oppression for centuries. What was different, though, was that starting in the mid-1700s in Western Europe, the desire for political and economic freedom was going to become their dominant ideology for the next 250 years. This progressive idea that individuals could have rights and freedoms became known as liberalism. So there had been some work done for centuries before that. In Social 20, we talk about the divine right of kings and the divine right theory that the monarchy was chosen by God to be the ruler, and to question government, to question the king, was to question God. And we live in a very church-centric society, so we did not question God. We didn't question government. We don't hold the government accountable. God will do that. But through the Renaissance, through the rebirth, the reintroduction of Greek individualism following the 15th century fall of Constantinople, we have this idea of liberalism coming back into Europe. And with it will inspire some new interpretations as to what is the role of government? Who should decide on who the government should be? And ultimately, what kind of relationship or contract exists between the government and the people? So, weighing in on this topic, we have those philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, and we did do some unpacking with Hobbes in lesson 1. Hopefully you watched that video. As we saw in the video, that Hobbes would suggest that without government, we would live in our natural state, which is at a state of war with each other. And during that state of war, life would not be worth living because your security would be constantly compromised. Even the biggest of us couldn't sleep easy because while you're sleeping, you're at a state of war with those who are awake, who covet what you have, and will use violence to take it. So there's a very animalistic, jungle-like idea or vision of man's nature here, where we're at this constant competition. And Hobbes would suggest that the reason why we have government is because we need security. And without government, we won't have it. So the only way to have security and stability and therefore a life worth living is to surrender our natural freedom to a Leviathan. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees that our purpose is to be obedient so that life is worth living. John Locke would be that natural voice of opposition to Hobbes. Locke would suggest that we are embodied with natural rights, like right to life, liberty, and property, and that if government exists, then the government's job is to protect our rights, not to restrict them, but to protect them, to help unlock them, to, no pun intended, to help unlock them and protect them from each other. And therefore, Locke's ideas were seen as more revolutionary and will also help become one of those founding fathers of liberalism. Now, we have a guy here, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You watch the video. You know that Jean-Jacques Rousseau is an interesting guy. I like Rousseau in the sense that he favors individualism sometimes, he favors collectivism sometimes. So I talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I often say that Rousseau politically is an individualist. He believes that government must exist with the consent, the will of the people. That it's the will of the people that makes a legitimate government. In fact, Rousseau would, if given the opportunity, would argue that we should have direct democracy, that we shouldn't even surrender our political will to a representative, that a better, pure, better form of democracy would be direct democracy, where our voices are not somehow manipulated or contaminated through that representative level. As much as he is pro-political individualism, economically, he sees private property as one of the causes of conflict in society. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau would like to see public property, and public property, cooperation publicly, public ownership of wealth, that's seen as collectivism. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of those individuals that shows that it's difficult to label somebody just an individualist or a collectivist because he has nuances of both. He's politically very much an individualist, direct democracy. Can't get much more individualist than that, aside from maybe anarchy. And then economically, he's very much a collectivist, public property. So I find him interesting. Another name that pops up here is Edmund Burke. His reaction to liberalism was that liberalism was ignoring, betraying some of that great chain of being. Conservatives, classic conservatives like Edmund Burke, they looked at the change being created through revolutions like the French Revolution, and he wasn't hopeful about the future of mankind, because what he was seeing was mankind being violent and irrational and destroying the foundation of society that had been successful. So Edmund Burke, like many other conservatives, they see a need to honor the traditions, the generations that have allowed us in the great chain of being to become who we are today, and not to radically alter that direction. Conservatives are open to some change, but very slow and well thought out change. Within this time of liberalism, we also see the rise of the middle class. So, at the same time that people are debating politically and socially, how should society be organized, economically, we have another revolution, and it's the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, the spread of capitalism, we have the creation of great wealth, and eventually the creation of a new class, a middle class that has economic power. And their growing economic power will help influence their desire for political power that we'll see with the growth of universal suffrage. So what is liberalism? Well, we have some key principles here. Let's make it simple. Liberalism can be defined as promoting freedom. Now, John Stuart Mill, from our last lesson, would suggest that your freedom does need to be restricted when it harms others. But freedom is that foundation. Give me liberty or give me death. Freedom is that foundation of liberalism. Even Voltaire would suggest that I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. That freedom is so essential that even your freedom, I'd rather die than see your freedom taken away. Even if your freedom is based upon an argument I can't agree with, I'd rather die than see you censored. It's an amazing thing to think of, even now in 2020. Individualism is another key principle of liberalism. Civil liberties, political liberties. This will end up manifesting into a system that we look at and identify as democracy. Another key aspect of this liberalism is the idea of reason and ration, that mankind is rational, that we're reasonable. Therefore, discussion can have some purpose. If the masses are irrational, if the masses lack reason, then there's no point of having a discussion among the masses about our, domestic and foreign policies of the future. But if mankind, plural, has the ability to unlock reason and rational ideas, then it promotes dissent. We need the right to oppose government because government doesn't have a monopoly on what is rational or reasonable. Hobbes would not promote dissent because through dissent we would create the law of the jungle would come back, right? We would have that constant state of war with each other. But as we're seeing here, individuals like John Locke would promote dissent because the individuals are rational, they are reasonable, and they might be able to see things differently and come up with a better solution. Another key aspect of liberalism is justice. The old regime, to go back to Social 20, the old regime was not built upon fairness, that some occupations were unlocked because of the lottery of birth. You're born into nobility and therefore certain positions in society, elevated positions, were afforded to you. There might be people more able than you are, but those positions are not open for them because of their position, their status at birth. So in the French Revolution, we see Napoleon introduce the concept of meritocracy. Meritocracy is this idea that you didn't have to be born a noble to become an officer in the Grand Army, that he wanted the best officers, not the best by birth, but the best by ability. So this idea of meritocracy ends up being included in the concept of justice, of liberalism. So too is rule of law. The idea that we need to have justice that is equal for people regardless of their background. That, if somebody that is a noble has committed murder, they shouldn't receive a different trial than someone who's a simple commoner. That rule of law means that everyone, regardless of status, wealth, gender, should have the same rights before the court. The same type of trial, the same type of justice. And you could argue that we still lack that in North America today. That some people do seem to get different outcomes than others because of their social value attached to them. So we have some cartoons here in the notes that allow you an opportunity to see, okay, now that I know some terms related to liberalism, looking at the cartoons, can I see what aspects of liberalism are being exposed through the cartoon, and what is the perspective about it? So this cartoon here, with organized crime and gang rule and bootleg profits, with all that wealth, surrounded them, and you got the individual in the corner called the law, and they're shooting justice at them. Is this questioning the rule of law? Does it want the rule of law? Does it want more justice? Or is it suggesting that justice and liberalism is flawed? So that's something for you to unpack and say, what kind of society is the cartoonist wanting to create? What's the problem being exposed, and what's the solution? Is it more or less liberalism? Then we have another cartoon. Canadian law is applied to the majority of citizens, and for Native protesters, get out of jail free. What does that mean? You can tell me during the hang-up. Another aspect of liberalism is tolerance, an acceptance of the rights of minorities, willingness to accommodate moral, cultural, and political diversity. So to what extent do we have tolerance in Canada? When you're reading through these, you should be trying to, apply your new knowledge and say, does this describe the Canada? Does this describe the Alberta? Does this describe the community I live in? Or within our community, do we see minorities that have less rights than others? Another part of it is the tyranny of the majority. Tyranny of the majority is still tyranny. Even if it's democratic, it's still tyranny. So tyranny of the majority is when you have 50% plus one that agree upon a certain outcome. But if it's still in violation of freedom, of human rights in essence, it's still tyranny. It's still showing a society that is at its heart based upon not tolerance, but intolerance. So we do have some critics of liberalism, and they're unpacked in chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the textbook as well. Our notes here also talk about the evolving nature of liberalism, and there's some connections to ideas like political correctness. And what it's trying to question is, if liberalism is an evolving ideology, is it possible that it evolves in a way that eventually creates a society that is more flawed than the one it was evolving away from? So taking words out of our conversation like Christmas, is that making a better or a worse society? So that's the first half of the notes. Second half of the notes is pretty important. It's going to talk about political spectrums. And although this may be a review, if you did look at political spectrums in Social 20, this might be new for many of you. I'm going to go through this fairly slowly, and definitely this is a part that if you have questions, you should really ask me about them. You're going to need to be able to use these terms when you unpack sources in A1 and A2, but you're also going to want to be able to use them to try to dissect multiple choice sources as well. So a political spectrum, in essence, is a measurement of change. How much change do we want to see in society, and what type of change do we want to see? So we're going to end up introducing words like radical and reactionary and moderate. We're going to add words like liberal and conservative. And then we can complicate it further by adding fascism and communism and trying to put different parties in here as well. It can get quite complicated. So, to make it easy, we're going to begin with the word conservative. In terms of the spectrum of change, conservatives like it the way it is. They like the status quo. They like to honor those traditions. Thinking of Edmund Burke, the great chain of being that has provided the generations of foundational building of our communities to establish the society that we live in today. We need to honor those traditions. That's conservatism. Conservatives like the status quo. Now, sometimes people look at the world and they say, you know what? No, I don't like it the way it is. I like it the way it was. I'd like to go back. I'd like to go back to the 7th century and the time of Muhammad and recreate the world that existed at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Many would see that as reactionary because there's this return to a glorious past. The key to unlock the term reactionary would be that when you are willing to use violence to recreate a world that once was. So reactionaries don't like the status quo. They want to go back to a glorious past. But they're so committed to returning to that glory of the past that they're willing to use violence to achieve it. Those would be reactionaries. So in the United States, right now, there's a lot of racial war happening in the streets. And within that racial warfare, there would be some individuals who look back at the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and really wish maybe that didn't happen. And maybe they're looking back and they wish America could be great again, in the sense that America would be one where ethnically certain people are segregated. Now, when they start using violence to intimidate people, to recreate the America of old, that's reactionary. So groups like the KKK would be examples of reactionary groups trying to use violence to stop the evolution of society. So we have conservatives and reactionaries, and they're both to the right of center. Reactionaries are further to the right than conservatives. there aren't many Canadians that are reactionary. The Conservative Party of Canada might be the group that would most identify as conservatives. Here in Alberta, we do have a society that really has a lot of conservative elements to it. Now, as we progress towards the middle of the spectrum and even to the left of the political spectrum, we'll get to the term liberal. Liberals are pro-change. Liberalism was about change, right? That ideology that is evolving, and we need to be forward-thinking, thinking of the future more than the past, progressive, innovative. So liberals are all of those things. They are pro-change. Conservatives like the status quo. Liberals want to see some change. Sometimes people are more than just passionate about change. They are violently passionate about change. And they don't want to see just a little change. They want to see a lot of change. We often use the term radical to describe that. So in 1918, in Russia, we had groups of society, communists, that wanted to create a new Russia. A Russia that would be a nation that was no longer feudalistic, was no longer based upon capitalism, but based upon the doctrine of Karl Marx. So they wanted to create something new. And they were so passionate about creating that they were willing to use violence to intimidate others. And ultimately, that violence led to a civil war. And out of that civil war came a new nation created, the USSR, under Lenin and eventually Stalin. Under that scenario, communism is seen as a radical idea. They hadn't attempted it before in Russia. It was something new. And the individuals trying to create it, they were using violence to attempt to create it. In America today, we have individuals in the streets of America attempting to change America by using violence. If they're attempting to change it in a new direction, they're radicals. If they're attempting to change it in an old direction, they're reactionaries. But as we can see in this chart, rather than it being a spectrum that's a simple line, the chart ends up looking like a horseshoe because aside from their end goal, radicals and reactionaries begin to look a lot alike. They agree upon the means, they don't agree upon the ends. So a radical and reactionary, although they're trying to create two different societies, from afar, they may look to be very similar people. And that's why this spectrum, rather than being shown as a straight line, curves at the end as the actions at either end begin to look very close. So in Social 20, we ended up studying, Lenin and Stalin and the USSR and the radical ideologies that they created. And we studied the reactionary ideologies of Nazi Germany, as Hitler was trying to recreate a glorious past. Better yet, in Italy, as Mussolini was trying to recreate the glory of Rome. We had reactionary Mussolini and radical Stalin, who were both dictators, who both attempted to be totalitarian. And because they both had those same techniques of dictatorship, from afar, they looked to be quite similar. So there's many different ways to show the spectrum. Here's a spectrum that shows the Canadian major parties on it, Conservatives to the right of center, the Liberals hovering around center. Within the Liberal Party, it's a big tent. There'll be some people that are further to the right than others. Generally, the Liberals, though, are to the left of the Conservatives. Generally, the NDP are to the left of the Liberals. The NDP are a little bit more progressive than the Liberals, a little bit more liberal than the Liberals, because they are attempting to create even more fundamental change. But the NDP are not suggesting to use violence. So that's why the NDP is not to the far left and being seen as radical. Conservatives, the party, are not talking about using violence to recreate a glorious past, and that's why they're to the right of center, but not all the way over where the reactionaries would be. Now, one final thing that does confuse people is the term liberalism. And no doubt here, right at the beginning of the course, first time you're hearing it, this is still going to sound confusing. That's why I asked you to read the textbook first and to watch the Williams videos, because sometimes it takes the entire course for some of these concepts to make sense. Liberalism was meant to be an evolving ideology. So liberalism, as we began with today, if it's coming from the 18th century, no doubt it has changed now that we're in the 21st century. So the liberalism that was is not the liberalism that is. So when we go back to the 18th century, we go back to liberalism economically, we would see individuals like Adam Smith. And his big concept was laissez-faire, hands off. Government should keep their hands off the economy. We want to be free of government, right? Free from government. But as generations began to suffer living free from government, there was pressure upon the government to change their relationship. And instead of being free from government, we want it to be free through government. Rather than the government not regulating the economy, we might need the government to be there to offer us welfare. So now we have a term called modern liberalism instead of classic liberalism. So modern liberalism is this idea that instead of being free from, we're free through government. So when we look at terms like liberalism, we have to consider which liberalism are we talking about? Which era is this from? What kind of relationship should be existing between government and government? So the note package here goes through classic liberalism and its evolution into modern liberalism. Talks about it politically and economically. And then we get to a whole second set of notes. So the list of notes was complete the first time, but then I decided, you know what? Let's offer a second set of notes just to go into more detail again. So my task for you would be to read through the notes, and as you read through the notes, take note on the definition of liberalism, but also the evolution of liberalism. And then you can always challenge yourself by looking at this quote from Margaret Thatcher and seeing what is she saying about liberalism. Is she saying it's a good thing, a bad thing? What kind of government is she wanting to create? What kind of problem is she exposing in society? And does she want more or less freedom to solve that problem? Here's those additional notes that offers a summary of chapters 2 and 3 of the textbook. And again, this isn't a course where you're going to be tested on history, but sometimes understanding the history behind the sources for the essays can help unlock the context of the source. And there will be some history tested on the multiple choice. So take some time, read over this, and I will see you at the Hangout.